Step away from the vehicle.
I already identified myself. Federal Task Force. Verify the credentials.
What are you doing out here?
Active assignment.
Doing what?
Not something I'm explaining on the shoulder when you can verify it in under a minute.
Turn around.
You putting cuffs on me before verification?
Turn around.
A county sheriff conducted a roadside stop and detained a man who had already presented federal credentials identifying himself as an undercover agent. The decision to proceed with the arrest initiated an internal affairs investigation and ultimately led to a criminal case and a prison sentence. At the time of the detention, Sheriff Daniel Rourke was operating within his county on a routine patrol. There was no active emergency or immediate threat associated with the vehicle he stopped. The driver complied promptly, pulling over in a controlled manner and keeping his hands visible. The driver, Marcus Hale, was assigned to a federal Department of Justice task force and was operating in an undercover capacity. His conduct during the stop reflected standard law enforcement training, with deliberate movements and measured responses. Upon approach, Rourke began questioning without clearly establishing a basis for the stop. Hale responded directly and without escalation. When asked for identification, he produced federal credentials. At that stage, standard procedure would require verification of the credentials and reassessment of the situation. Instead, Rourke continued questioning, focusing on Hale's presence in the area, the nature of his assignment, and authorization details. These inquiries extended beyond local jurisdiction. Hale reiterated his status and confirmed he was engaged in an active federal assignment. His responses remained consistent and controlled. Rourke did not adjust his approach and instead instructed Hale to exit the vehicle. This marked a shift from a traffic stop to a detention scenario without a clearly articulated legal basis. Hale complied and again identified himself as a federal agent. The information was not acknowledged. A second officer, Deputy Collins, was present and observed the interaction. No intervention occurred at that stage. Rourke proceeded with a pat-down search, despite the absence of any observable threat indicators. Hale stated that the detention lacked legal justification. The interaction continued without modification. When asked about weapons, Hale disclosed that a service weapon was secured inside the vehicle, consistent with his role. Rather than prompting verification, this information contributed to further escalation. Rourke instructed Hale to place his hands behind his back. Hale restated his identity before complying. Handcuffs were applied, transitioning the encounter into a custodial detention. Following the arrest, Rourke began articulating reasons for the detention, citing suspicion and non-compliance. These justifications were not aligned with the documented sequence of events. Rourke then ordered a search of the vehicle without a warrant or consent. Deputy Collins hesitated, but carried out the instruction. The search revealed federal equipment and documentation consistent with Hale's identification. The presence of federal materials did not alter the course of action. The situation had by that point escalated beyond a routine stop, involving the detention of a federal agent and interference with an active federal operation. Federal agents operate under structured reporting protocols, including scheduled check-ins. Hale's failure to report within the expected time frame triggered internal alerts. Supervisors identified the disruption and initiated follow-up procedures. By the time the roadside encounter concluded, the matter had already moved beyond local jurisdiction and into federal oversight. After the roadside detention, Hale was transported to the county station for processing. At that point, the situation moved from an external encounter into a controlled environment where procedures are documented more closely and decisions carry greater legal weight. Rourke continued to treat the matter as a standard arrest. Hale remained in restraints during transport and was not given the opportunity to contact federal supervisors. His identification had already been presented, and no additional verification was initiated by the sheriff's office. At the station, booking procedures were initiated. This included logging personal details, securing property, and preparing formal charges. The charges referenced suspicion and noncompliance, consistent with the justifications stated earlier at the roadside. Hale continued to identify himself as a federal agent during processing. His statements were consistent with what had been presented at the scene. No effort was made by the sheriff to confirm his status through federal channels before proceeding further. The decision to move forward with booking marked a significant escalation. At that point, the detention was no longer limited to a temporary stop or field investigation. It had become a formal custodial action, with documentation and legal implications attached. During this process, the contents recovered from Hale's vehicle remained in the custody of the sheriff's department. These materials included federal equipment and documents associated with an active assignment. Handling such materials without coordination introduced additional legal concerns. Deputy Collins remained present during portions of the booking process. His earlier hesitation at the roadside did not translate into intervention at the station. The procedures continued without internal challenge. The absence of verification is a key factor at this stage. Standard protocol, when presented with federal credentials, would involve immediate confirmation through appropriate agencies. That step was not taken. Instead, the process moved forward based on the initial assumption made during the stop. Meanwhile, Hale's failure to complete a scheduled check-in began to draw attention from his supervising unit. Federal operations rely on strict reporting intervals, particularly during active assignments. A missed check-in triggers review protocols designed to locate and secure the agent. Initial attempts to reach Hale were unsuccessful. This prompted escalation within his agency. Supervisors began tracing his last known activity, including location data and communication logs. Within a short period, attention focused on the area where the traffic stop had occurred. Coordination efforts began to determine whether local law enforcement had any contact with Hale. At the county level, no immediate notification had been made to federal authorities regarding the detention. This delay contributed to the widening gap between local actions and federal awareness. As the situation developed, the legal exposure increased. The continued detention of a federal agent, combined with the handling of federal materials and the absence of verification, expanded the scope of potential violations. By the time federal supervisors confirmed that Hale had been taken into custody by the sheriff's department, the situation had already moved beyond a procedural error. It now involved multiple layers of potential misconduct, including unlawful detention and interference with a federal operation. The next phase would bring direct federal involvement into the sheriff's office. Federal awareness escalated quickly once Hale's absence was confirmed. His unit identified the last known location tied to his assignment and began coordinating with regional offices. Within hours, communication reached the appropriate federal channels responsible for agent recovery and operational integrity. Direct contact was initiated with the county sheriff's department. Initial responses did not immediately resolve the situation. The information provided at the local level did not reflect the full scope of what had occurred during the stop and subsequent booking. At that point, federal authorities moved beyond inquiry and into direct intervention. Representatives from federal law enforcement and oversight divisions arrived at the sheriff's office. Their objective was immediate verification of Hale's status, recovery of federal property, and assessment of any procedural violations. Hale was still in custody when federal personnel arrived. His identification was re-examined and confirmed through official databases without delay. This verification established his status conclusively and eliminated any remaining ambiguity. The detention was determined to be unlawful. Hale was released from custody following confirmation. Attention then shifted to the actions taken during the stop and booking process. Federal investigators began documenting each step, including the initial justification for the stop, the decision to disregard credentials, the application of restraints, and the search of the vehicle. Body camera footage and station records were secured as evidence. These materials provided a continuous record of the interaction, from roadside engagement through booking procedures. The consistency between Hale's statements and the recorded footage became a central factor in the investigation. Internal Affairs initiated a parallel review at the departmental level. This included examination of prior complaints, use of force reports, and patterns in Rourke's conduct during previous stops. The review extended beyond the single incident, focusing on whether similar behavior had occurred in the past. Deputy Collins and other personnel present during the incident were interviewed. Their accounts were compared against recorded evidence. Discrepancies between statements and footage were documented. The investigation identified multiple points where standard procedures were not followed. These included failure to verify federal credentials, lack of probable cause for detention, unauthorized search of a vehicle containing federal materials, and continuation of booking despite available identification. Legal analysis determined that the conduct extended beyond departmental policy violations. Federal statutes were implicated, including provisions related to deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of a federal officer. The case was referred for federal prosecution. At that stage, the situation transitioned from an internal disciplinary matter to a criminal case. The evidence collected during the investigation formed the basis for formal charges against Sheriff Rourke. The federal case moved forward with a focus on documented actions rather than interpretation. By that stage, the sequence of events was already well established through body camera footage, booking records, dispatch logs, and federal verification data. Formal charges were filed under federal law. The primary statute applied was 18 U.S. Code Section 242, which addresses deprivation of rights under color of law. The charge centered on the use of official authority to detain an individual without legal justification, despite clear identification and absence of probable cause. Additional charges related to obstruction were considered based on the interference with an active federal operation. The unauthorized search of a federally assigned vehicle and handling of operational materials became part of that analysis. Rourke's defense relied on standard arguments commonly raised in cases involving law enforcement conduct. The central claim was qualified immunity, asserting that the actions taken fell within the scope of discretionary authority and were based on perceived threat and uncertainty during the encounter. That argument did not hold under review. The court examined whether a reasonable officer, presented with the same information, would have acted similarly. The presence of valid federal credentials, repeated identification by Hale, and the absence of any articulable threat were central factors. The evidence showed that Rourke had multiple opportunities to verify, pause, or disengage, and chose not to do so. Body camera footage played a decisive role. It captured the entire progression of the stop, including the presentation of credentials, the escalation in commands, and the application of restraints. The footage also documented the lack of any behavior that would support suspicion or justify detention. Testimony from federal supervisors confirmed Hale's assignment status, reporting protocols, and the disruption caused by the detention. They established that Hale was operating within the scope of a sanctioned investigation, and that his failure to check in triggered internal response procedures. Deputy Collins and other personnel were called to testify regarding their observations. Their accounts reinforced the timeline established by recorded evidence. The lack of intervention, while noted, did not alter the primary responsibility attributed to Rourke as the decision maker. The prosecution focused on consistency. Each piece of evidence aligned with Hale's account and contradicted the justifications provided after the arrest. The sequence did not show confusion or rapidly evolving threat conditions. It showed continuation of authority despite contrary information. The defense attempted to frame the situation as a misinterpretation of credentials and a precautionary response to the presence of a firearm. That position was undermined by the recorded exchange and the absence of any attempt to verify the information provided. The court rejected the qualified immunity claim. The ruling emphasized that clearly established rights had been violated and that the conduct exceeded the bounds of lawful authority. The jury deliberated over a relatively short period. The evidence required minimal interpretation. The central facts were documented and consistent across multiple sources. A guilty verdict was returned on all applicable counts. During sentencing, the court addressed the nature of the conduct and its broader implications. The ruling emphasized the responsibility associated with law enforcement authority and the consequences of failing to operate within legal boundaries. Rourke was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. The sentence reflected both the violation itself and the position of authority under which it occurred. In addition to incarceration, he was removed from office and lost eligibility for benefits associated with his role. The outcome extended beyond the individual case. At the departmental level, Internal Affairs completed its review and issued findings related to procedural failures and lack of oversight. Policy revisions were introduced, including mandatory verification protocols when federal identification is presented, and stricter requirements for supervisory review during detentions. Training procedures were updated to address jurisdictional limits and reinforce obligations when interacting with federal personnel. Documentation standards were also revised to ensure that justification for stops and detentions is clearly established at the outset. At the federal level, the case contributed to ongoing discussions regarding coordination between local and federal agencies. It reinforced the expectation that identification and jurisdiction must be recognized immediately to prevent escalation. The incident became a reference point in training and legal analysis. It demonstrated how a routine stop, when handled without adherence to procedure, can develop into a federal criminal case with long-term consequences. For Hale, the outcome confirmed the legal boundaries that govern such encounters. His conduct during the incident remained consistent with training, and the documentation of the event provided a clear record of the interaction. The case concluded with established accountability at multiple levels. It did not rely on interpretation or external narrative. The result was based on recorded evidence, procedural review, and application of federal law. If you followed this case through to the end, consider how often situations like this depend on a single decision made in real time. And if you want to see more documented cases like this, you can follow for future analyses.
What's in the bag?
Snacks. I bought them.
You got a receipt?
Yeah, in my pocket.
Why didn't you show me that first?
You didn't ask me for it first.
Don't get smart.
I told you I bought it.
You've been acting suspicious since I pulled up.
I was just walking home.
What happens when a police officer decides someone is guilty before checking anything, and that someone turns out to be a kid who did everything right? This situation didn't start complicated. It became a problem because of how one officer handled it, step by step, in public, on camera, with no real evidence. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you follow real stories about accountability and how situations like this play out, subscribe. These aren't rare incidents. They just don't always get seen. This happened early evening in a quiet neighborhood. People were outside. Nothing unusual going on. Molly Carter was 12 years old. He lived a few blocks away and was allowed to walk to the corner store on his own. That day was normal. He went in, picked up a drink and a couple of snacks, paid in cash, got a receipt, and left. The store owner, Mrs. Alvarez, saw the whole thing. No issue, no confusion. Just a kid buying snacks and heading home. Malik put the receipt in his pocket and started walking back. Officer Daniel Reeves was driving through the area at the same time. There was no confirmed call tied to Malik. No verified report connected to what he was about to act on. Just his own suspicion forming as he watched a kid walking away from a store. He stopped the car and got out. He called Malik over and immediately started questioning him. What's in the bag? Where did it come from? How did he pay for it? Malik answered clearly. Said he bought everything from the store behind him. Said he had a receipt. That should have been enough to at least slow things down and check. Reeves didn't check anything. He kept asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch a mistake. There wasn't one. Malik gave the same answers each time. Then Reeves took the backpack and opened it. Inside were snacks and a drink. Exactly what Malik said. At that point, a reasonable officer verifies and moves on. Reeves didn't. He switched focus to the money. Asked how Malik got it. Asked if someone gave it to him. Started building a different angle instead of verifying the first one. Malik answered again. Said it was his money. Said he bought the items. His tone changed, though. You could tell he was getting nervous. He wasn't arguing. He was trying to explain something that shouldn't have needed explaining. People nearby started paying attention. 2 teenagers across the street pulled out their phones. A delivery driver slowed down and stayed parked. It wasn't loud, but it was clear something was off. Reeves noticed the attention. Instead of stepping back and checking facts, he stayed locked in. Mrs. Alvarez came out of the store when she saw what was happening. She walked straight over and told Reeves the kid had just paid. She saw it herself. There was no theft, no missing items, no problem. That should have ended the situation right there. Reeves didn't end it. He changed the reason. Instead of theft, he started calling it suspicious behavior. No details. Just a general claim to justify continuing. That shift mattered. Because now the original reason didn't hold up. And instead of stopping, he adjusted it to keep control. Mrs. Alvarez pushed back. She repeated that nothing was stolen. Reeves ignored that and kept the situation going. Malik stayed where he was. Didn't move. Didn't argue. Just waited. Then Reeves told him to call his parents. Not as help. As pressure. Malik took out his phone and called his father. His voice was different now. Short, controlled. He explained he was being stopped and couldn't leave. Reeves stood there while he made the call, still acting like he had full control of this situation. He didn't ask who the father was. He didn't think it mattered. That was the mistake. Because the person on the other end of that call wasn't just coming to pick up his son. And once he arrived, this situation was going to flip completely. By the time Malik finished that call, the situation had already gone too far. What made it worse was that Officer Reeves still had multiple chances to stop, check the facts, and end it. He didn't do that. He stayed with the same approach that caused the problem in the first place. He kept pressing a 12-year-old kid for answers he had already given, as if repeating the questions could turn a normal explanation into guilt. Malik kept telling him the same thing. He said he bought the snacks at the store behind them. He said he paid in cash. He said he had the receipt. None of that changed, because none of it was false. Reeves didn't move toward the store to verify it. He didn't ask the owner to confirm the purchase in any serious way. He didn't radio dispatch to check whether there had even been a theft complaint. That's the part that matters here. He was acting first and checking later, and once people started watching, he looked more interested in staying in control than getting it right. By then, the whole thing had become visible to the street around them. 2 teenagers across the road had their phones out and were recording steadily. A delivery driver had stopped nearby and stayed put. A woman from one of the houses had stepped onto her porch. Nobody was creating a scene. Reeves did that himself. The crowd only formed because what he was doing to that kid didn't look justified. Mrs. Alvarez, the store owner, stayed close and kept trying to correct it. She told Reeves that Malik had paid. She made it clear there was no missing merchandise and no theft from her store. She wasn't guessing. She had been standing at the register. She knew exactly what happened. That should have ended the stop. Instead, Reeves changed direction. He moved away from the theft angle and started calling Malik's behavior suspicious. That's usually where bad stops fall apart. The original reason stops working, so the officer starts reaching for broader language. Suspicious behavior sounds official, but without facts behind it, it's just cover. Malik was still standing there, doing what kids in that position usually do, when they know they're not winning the situation by speaking more. He answered what he was asked. He gave his name. He said where he lived. He kept his voice under control. But the tension was getting to him. Anyone watching could see that. He wasn't acting guilty. He was acting like a child stuck with an adult who had already decided not to believe him. Reeves kept the pressure on anyway. He asked about the backpack again, even though he had already opened it. He asked about the money again, even though Malik had already explained it. At that point, the questioning wasn't about getting information. It was about keeping Malik in place and keeping authority over the scene. Mrs. Alvarez stepped in again and repeated that there was no report from her store. No one had stolen anything. No one had run. No one had hidden anything. She was giving Reeves a clean way to back out of it. He didn't take it. He told her to step back and let him handle it. That didn't make him look more in control. It made it obvious he was ignoring the one adult there with actual first-hand knowledge. Another patrol car slowed near the end of the block. The officer inside didn't jump out. He watched first. That usually means one thing. He was trying to figure out whether this was a real stop or a mess he was about to walk into. Reeves never waved him in. He never called for support. He never gave a clear explanation out loud. That also tells you something. Officers speak up when the facts are solid. They get quieter when they know the situation sounds weak the second another cop hears it. Malik looked down the street more than once after that. He wasn't trying to run. He was waiting. That's an important difference. He had called for help because he understood, even at 12 years old, that the truth by itself was not ending this situation. Then a black SUV turned onto the block. It came in normally, no sudden stop, no drama. It pulled up near the curb, close enough for Malik to notice right away. He recognized it immediately. Reeves looked at the vehicle, then went back to Malik, still acting like the scene belonged to him. He had no idea the next person walking toward him wasn't just a parent coming to pick up a scared kid. He thought he was still managing a minor stop. He wasn't, because the man who stepped out of that SUV understood police procedure, understood street encounters, and understood exactly what Reeves had already done wrong before he even said a word. And in a situation like this, that changes everything fast. When the SUV pulled up, the situation didn't look dramatic. But this is where everything actually shifted. Up to that point, Officer Reeves was operating under one assumption, that he was dealing with a kid he could control, question, and keep in place until he decided he was done. No urgency to verify. No pressure to be precise. Just authority carrying the situation. That assumption was about to collapse. Malik's father stepped out and approached calmly. No shouting, no rushing. He didn't come in emotional. He came in focused, and that alone already changed the balance. People who know how these situations work don't react fast. They listen first. He looked at Malik, then at Reeves, then at the store owner still standing there. In a few seconds, he had enough to understand the basics. This wasn't a chaotic scene. It was one officer holding on to something that didn't make sense anymore. Then he asked Reeves what was going on. Reeves answered like he still had control. He framed it as a possible theft and said Malik wasn't cooperating. That's important because at that moment, he committed to a version that didn't match what everyone else had already seen. The father didn't argue. He didn't try to out-talk him. He went straight to structure. He asked what was stolen. That question matters because it forces specifics. You can't stay vague once that's asked. Reeves didn't give a clear answer. Then came the next one. Who reported the theft? Again, no clear answer. At this point, the situation starts to look weak, even to people who don't know procedure. When basic questions don't get direct answers, people notice. The father kept going. He asked if the store confirmed anything was missing. And now, Reeves had a problem. Because the store owner was right there, and she had already said multiple times that nothing was taken. This is where most officers would step back and reset. Admit the confusion, verify, end it. Reeves didn't do that. He switched the reason again, moved away from theft, and called it suspicious behavior. That shift told everyone watching exactly what was happening. He didn't have a solid reason, but he wasn't ready to let go of control. And this is where the father stopped treating it like a conversation and started treating it like a breakdown of decisions. He didn't raise his voice. He just started walking through it. He pointed out that Malik had been consistent from the beginning. He pointed out that the only witness had already confirmed the purchase. He pointed out that the bag was searched before anything was verified. That's not arguing. That's building a record. And here's the part Reeves didn't account for. This wasn't just happening in front of a parent. It was happening in front of multiple cameras and another officer who had now stepped closer and was clearly listening. That second officer didn't jump in. He didn't support Reeves. He stayed neutral. That silence matters. When backup doesn't step in, it usually means they don't agree with what they're seeing. Then the recognition hit. The second officer addressed Malik's father properly, not as a random civilian, by title. That's when Reeves realized who he was talking to. And you could see the shift immediately. His tone changed, his posture changed. The confidence he had earlier, gone. Now he was explaining instead of controlling. But it was too late for that, because the issue wasn't just that he made a bad stop. It's that he had multiple chances to correct it and chose not to. The father didn't react emotionally to the title being recognized. He stayed on the same track. That's what makes it worse for the officer. No yelling to hide behind. No chaos to blend into. Just clear, calm questions in a situation that doesn't hold up. He asked why Malik was still being held there after everything had already been explained. That question didn't have a real answer, because at that point, there was no legal or practical reason to continue. Reeves didn't try to push back again. He couldn't. The structure of the situation was already exposed. The father told him to return the backpack. Reeves did it immediately. That tells you everything about where the control actually was now. Malik stepped back with his father. The tension that had been sitting on him the entire time finally dropped, but the situation itself wasn't over yet. Because what just happened wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a full sequence of bad decisions, made in public, recorded from multiple angles, and now witnessed by someone who not only understood the system, but had authority over it. And once something reaches that point, it doesn't stay on the street. After the street stop, the case went into review. The evidence was simple. Reeves stopped Malik without confirming a theft. Mrs. Alvarez told him the items were paid for. He ignored that. He searched the backpack before verifying any crime. When the theft claim failed, he changed the reason to suspicious behavior. That sequence hurt him. Internal Affairs reviewed the Bodycam and bystander videos. The footage showed the same thing from every angle. Malik gave consistent answers. The store owner cleared him. Reeves kept the stop going anyway. Then they checked Reeves's record. There were earlier complaints with the same pattern: aggressive stops, weak justification, and escalation before verification. This case had stronger evidence, so the department could not brush it aside. He was removed from duty, then fired. His certification also went under review. That put his future in law enforcement at risk. The department made policy changes after that. Officers had to verify facts faster in stops involving minors. Searches had to be justified before they happened. Supervisors had to review stops where the reason changed during the encounter. Malik was not charged. He kept a clean record. That does not erase what happened. A 12-year-old was treated like a suspect without proof in public, while adults tried to tell the officer he was wrong. That is the point of the story. Reeves did not lose his job because Malik's father was the chief. He lost it because the stop was wrong. It was recorded. And this time the facts could not be covered up. Ask yourself one question. If nobody filmed it, would the outcome have been the same? Comment what you think. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more.
Turn around. We're done talking.
I already identified myself. U.S. Marshal. Go and check the information.
You don't get to tell me what to do out here.
I'm telling you what a competent officer would do.
You've been acting suspicious since I lit you up.
No, I pulled over, kept my hands visible, and identified myself.
Step away from the vehicle.
This stopped being your stop when I gave you federal credentials.
What happens when a deputy turns a basic stop into a power contest in front of the one person on that road who actually knows exactly where that deputy's authority ends? What started as a roadside detention turned into a serious legal problem when Deputy Travis Harlan refused to accept federal credentials from the man he had stopped. That man was U.S. Marshal Adrian Cross. Harlan kept pushing anyway. He kept acting like the badge in his own pocket mattered more than the law in front of him. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about bad stops, abuse of authority, and officers paying for their own arrogance, like the video and subscribe. This whole thing started because Harlan decided Adrian Cross looked wrong for the area. Cross had just left a joint task force meeting. Plain clothes, unmarked vehicle, normal for his assignment. He wasn't coming from a bar, wasn't driving recklessly, wasn't doing anything that would stand out to any officer who was actually looking for a violation. Harlan still picked his car out and stayed behind him long enough to make it obvious he wanted a reason to stop him. Then he hit the lights. Cross pulled over right away, safe shoulder, engine off, hands visible on the wheel. He knew exactly how stops go because he had worked alongside local law enforcement for years. He also knew when the tone was off from the first second. Harlan came up to the driver's side already acting like he had something bigger than a traffic stop. He didn't start with a violation. He didn't say what Cross had done. He started asking what he was doing in the area and where he was coming from. That told Cross a lot. When an officer has a real reason, he usually says it. Speed, lane issue, light out, registration, something. Harlan didn't do that. He went straight to presence. Why are you here? What are you doing here? That kind of stop usually means the officer decided first and started looking for justification second. Cross answered without giving him extra conversation. Then he told him he was a federal officer and could provide credentials. That should have changed the stop immediately. Instead, Harlan leaned into it harder. His tone got sharper. He demanded identification again, like Cross had sidestepped him, even though Cross was trying to identify himself in the clearest way possible. Cross reached slowly and showed his credentials, badge and ID. No sudden movement, no attitude, no reason for confusion. Harlan looked at them and rejected them. That was the real beginning of the problem. At that point, this was no longer about uncertainty. He had been given information that any reasonable officer would verify. Instead of doing that, he stepped back and called for backup. And the way he called it in mattered. He didn't say he had stopped someone identifying himself as a federal officer. He framed it like he had a suspicious subject who was not cooperating the way he wanted. That version started going into the record right there. Cross understood exactly what was happening. He didn't try to win a roadside argument. He stayed calm and let Harlan keep talking. That's what experience looks like. Sometimes the fastest way to expose bad policing is to let the officer commit fully to it on camera and on radio. Backup arrived within minutes. Deputy Marisol Vega came in and read the scene fast. Cross wasn't agitated, wasn't evasive, wasn't moving around. He was standing there, composed, speaking clearly, repeating the same information he had already given. He identified himself again. U.S. Marshal, federal assignment, credentials already shown, available to verify. Vega looked at Harlan because the obvious next move was to confirm it and settle the stop. That was the off-ramp. Harlan ignored it. Instead, he ordered Cross out of the vehicle. Cross got out immediately. No hesitation. No resistance. He kept his hands visible and did exactly what he was told. That point matters because officers like Harlan love to rewrite these moments later. They use words like tens, non-compliant, officer safety, subject behavior. Cross wasn't giving him any of that. Harlan still kept pushing the same questions. Why are you here? What are you doing in this area? Why didn't you identify yourself properly? That last part was ridiculous because Cross had already done it more than once. By then, somebody nearby had noticed the stop and started recording. Phone up, clear angle, enough to catch the broad shape of what was happening. That should have made Harlan slow down and think. It did the opposite. Some officers get careful when they know there's video. Others feel challenged. Harlan looked like the second type. He got louder, more rigid, more interested in asserting himself than fixing the stop. Then he told Cross to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Cross paused for a second. Not to resist, to think. Because once cuffs go on, the whole stop changes. He knew that. He also knew roadside arguments with the wrong deputy can get worse fast, so he complied. He turned around and put his hands behind his back. Vega hesitated. She could see this had gone too far. A man had identified himself as a U.S. Marshal, shown credentials, stayed calm, followed instructions, and was still about to be cuffed because one deputy had decided backing down would hurt his ego. Harlan took out the cuffs and locked them on. That was the moment the case really started. Not when the lights came on. Not when the questions started. When a county deputy put handcuffs on a federal officer, he had already been given every chance to verify, and Harlan still thought he was controlling the scene. He wasn't controlling anything anymore. He was creating evidence. With Adrian Cross in cuffs, the smart move would have been simple. Verify who he was. Slow the scene down. End it before it got worse. Deputy Travis Harlan did none of that. He kept feeding dispatch a version of events that made Cross sound suspicious and uncooperative, even though Cross had already identified himself and already shown credentials. That false framing mattered. Once it goes over the radio, it stops being just attitude on the roadside. It becomes part of the paper trail. Cross understood that immediately. That's why he didn't start arguing now. He had already made the key points. He was a U.S. Marshal. His credentials were valid. They could be checked. Harlan had heard all of that and chosen not to verify it. Deputy Marisol Vega saw where this was heading. She asked Harlan whether dispatch had actually run the credentials. He avoided the question and kept moving. That told her plenty. He wasn't trying to confirm facts. He was trying to protect the stop he had already committed to. Then Harlan asked about weapons in the vehicle. Cross answered directly. He said there was a service weapon in the car and that he was authorized to carry it. That answer should have narrowed the next step. Secure carefully, confirm identity, and stop improvising. Instead, Harlan opened the vehicle and started searching. Cross stated clearly that he did not consent. No attitude, no shouting, just a clean legal answer, calm enough that nobody could honestly claim he was being combative. Harlan ignored him and kept going through the car anyway. He checked the console, dug through the glove box, moved items around in the back seat. It didn't look like a focused search. It looked like someone hoping to find anything that could justify what he had already done. Nothing helped him. While he was doing that, the stop stopped belonging to him alone. One bystander was already recording, then another person started filming from a different angle. That's where officers lose control of the story. Once independent video exists, the report can't carry everything by itself anymore. Vega pressed him again. This time she asked if the badge number had been run. Again, he didn't take the easiest way out. That's what made the situation hard to defend, even before the supervisors got involved. One bad call at the start is damaging. Refusing every chance to correct it is what really buries people. Harlan had several chances to stop the damage. He passed on all of them. Cross, meanwhile, stayed measured. That wasn't weakness. It was discipline. He knew Harlan was building a case against himself, one decision at a time. And the more controlled he stayed, the cleaner that record would be later. Eventually, Harlan found the credentials again inside the vehicle, exactly where Cross had said they were. He looked at them longer this time. Any reasonable officer would have ended it there. He still didn't. He questioned whether they were real, not because the documents were unclear, because by then admitting they were real meant admitting everything after the first few minutes had been wrong. Vega stepped closer, looked at the credentials herself, and pushed for immediate verification. At that point, she was no longer hinting. She was trying to stop a disaster from getting worse. Dispatch ran it. The answer came back exactly as Cross had said from the beginning. Active U.S. Marshal, valid credentials, no confusion left, no excuse left either. And that left everybody standing there with the same ugly fact. Harlan had handcuffed a federal officer who had already identified himself, already cooperated, and already given him the means to verify everything lawfully. For a second, the whole scene stalled. That happens when the truth finally lands and nobody has a good way to talk around it. Vega told him to remove the cuffs. He did. No apology, no ownership, no explanation that made sense. He just uncuffed Cross and acted like the problem was over because the metal came off. It wasn't over. Cross brought his hands forward. The marks on his wrists were already visible. His car had been gone through. False claims had already gone over the radio. Witnesses had video. Backup had seen enough. The scene had already moved beyond a roadside mistake. Now it was a liability case. Adrian Cross didn't get back in his car and leave, because by then this was way past the point of letting a deputy wave it off and pretend nothing serious had happened. The cuffs were off, but that didn't fix anything. Harlan had already detained him, already searched the vehicle after being told there was no consent, and already fed dispatch a version that made Cross sound suspicious instead of truthful. That part was done. It was on camera, it was on radio. It was in the system. So Cross shifted from surviving the stop to documenting it. He asked for Harlan's full name, badge number, and a supervisor. He asked for the names of the deputies on scene too, not in a dramatic way, just directly, the way somebody asks questions when they already know exactly why they matter. Harlan didn't like that. You could tell. His answers got shorter. He had lost the tone he started with, but he was still trying to act like he controlled the stop. That wasn't true anymore. Once Cross started documenting, the power on that roadside changed. Vega saw it too. She was the one who pushed for a supervisor to come out. That mattered, because if she had stayed passive, Harlan might have tried to write the whole thing up before anyone above him understood how bad it was. Captain Dorsey got there a few minutes later, and the scene already looked terrible before anybody explained it. Cross still had marks on his wrists. The car had clearly been gone through. 2 people nearby were still recording. Vega looked tense. Harlan looked like a deputy trying to hold onto a version of events that was falling apart. Dorsey asked what happened. Harlan answered first, which made sense because deputies like him always try to frame the scene before anyone else gets a clean shot at it. He described it as suspicious activity, non-compliance, concern over weapons, and uncertainty about identity. He was trying to compress a bad stop into a version that sounded defensible if you only heard it once. Then Cross laid it out in order. He said he identified himself early. He said he presented credentials. He said verification was available from the beginning. He said he refused consent to search. He said he was cuffed anyway. He didn't ramble, didn't perform outrage. He just gave Dorsey a clean timeline that made Harlan's explanation look weak. That alone was bad for Harlan. Then Vega spoke, and that made it worse. She didn't do a full public takedown, but she confirmed enough. She confirmed that Cross had identified himself. She confirmed that the credentials had been available to check. She confirmed that the stop escalated before that happened. That was more than enough to tell Dorsey he wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. Now it's about whether the department is about to get dragged into a federal complaint and a civil case at the same time. Dorsey pulled Harlan aside and made a few calls. Cross made calls too. And that's when the stop stopped being Harlan's problem alone. Cross contacted his chain quickly. That matters because federal agencies don't treat this like a normal roadside dispute when one of their people gets unlawfully detained by a local deputy who ignored valid credentials. Once that call went out, the question wasn't whether this would be reviewed. The question was how bad the review was going to be. Cross also took photos before leaving. His wrists, the inside of the vehicle, the way his things had been disturbed. He got the names and numbers of the people recording nearby. Every one of those steps made sense. He wasn't collecting memories. He was preserving evidence before anyone had time to reshape the story. And Harlan had to stand there and watch that happen. That's where officers like him usually realize they misread the entire encounter. At the start, he thought he had found a person to control. Now he was watching a federal officer calmly build a case in front of him, one detail at a time. By later that evening, the first videos had already started spreading locally. Not huge yet, but enough. Local pages, police watch accounts, community groups. People don't need much when the facts are that clean. County deputy detains plainclothes U.S. Marshal ignores credentials, searches vehicle anyway. That headline doesn't need help. Once the video started moving, the sheriff's office lost the chance to manage this quietly. Internal affairs got involved that same night. The legal side did too. That's how departments act when they think the footage may be worse than the report. Nobody waits around when they can already see a lawsuit coming. By the next morning, Harlan was off patrol. That doesn't mean justice. Departments suspend, reassign, and shuffle people all the time. But it did tell you they knew the stop was radioactive. They weren't treating this like a citizen complaint that could sit in a file for a month. Cross spent the next day with agency leadership and counsel, walking through every part of it. The detention, the false radio framing, the refusal to verify, the search without consent, the bystander video, the marks from the cuffs, all of it. That's where the case widened. Because now it wasn't just about one deputy making bad calls on one roadside. Now lawyers were going to ask what Harlan's history looked like, what training he got, what supervisors ignored, and whether this department had seen warning signs before and done nothing. That's where departments start paying real money. Not because one officer embarrassed them, because one officer exposed what they tolerated before the cameras were rolling. Once lawyers got involved, the case stopped being about whether Deputy Travis Harlan had made a bad decision. That part was already obvious. The real fight became bigger than him. The questions changed. What had the department trained him to do? What had supervisors allowed him to keep doing? Had there been earlier complaints that should have put him under review long before he put handcuffs on a federal officer who had already identified himself? That's where county departments start losing money. Adrian Cross and his legal team moved fast. They already had the Bodycam issue, the dispatch traffic, the bystander recordings, the search without consent, and the false framing on the roadside. Those facts were strong on their own. Then they started looking at Harlan's record, and that's where things got worse for the county. There had been earlier complaints, not the kind that automatically end a career, the kind departments usually minimize. Stops that ran too long. Drivers saying Harlan got aggressive early. Reports that didn't fully match what other people remembered. Nothing by itself dramatic enough to force action. Put together, it started looking like a pattern that nobody had seriously corrected. That's poison in a civil case. Because once a plaintiff can show the officer didn't come out of nowhere, the department loses the easy excuse. It's no longer one deputy making one reckless call. Now it looks like a warning sign they ignored until it became too expensive to deny. Internal Affairs reviewed the stop. That part went badly for Harlan, too. The video didn't support the story he pushed at the scene. Cross had identified himself. Cross had stayed calm. Cross had refused consent clearly. Verification had been available early. Harlan kept escalating anyway. Then he used language over radio that made Cross sound suspicious when the actual footage showed a deputy refusing the easiest off-ramp on the scene. There wasn't much room to spin that. The sheriff's office put out a public statement after the story spread further. It used the usual language, matter under review. Commitment to professional policing, full cooperation. People say those lines every time a department gets caught flat-footed. By then, nobody serious was focusing on the statement. People wanted to know whether Harlan was fired, whether the county was getting sued, and how many people had looked the other way before the stop. Cross-filed. That's when the county's problem became measurable. His claim didn't just hit Harlan. It named the detention, the unlawful search, the false narrative built during the stop, and the supervisory failures behind it. The case said in plain terms that Harlan had acted like somebody who expected his version to be accepted automatically and expected the man in front of him to submit. He got the opposite. He got a U.S. Marshal who knew the law, preserved evidence, and had the resources to push the case all the way through. Depositions made it worse. Harlan had to answer for the order of events. Why he didn't verify first. Why he treated valid credentials like a bluff. Why he searched after consent was denied. Why he told dispatch Cross had not properly identified himself. Every one of those questions boxed him in. The body cam and outside video kept him from wandering too far, because the footage was sitting there, waiting to contradict him. That's the part officers like him never think about. The stop lasts minutes. The fallout lasts months, sometimes years. And every bad decision comes back in order. Vega's role mattered too. She wasn't painted as the main problem, but she became important to the record because she had seen enough to know the stop was wrong before it ended. Her testimony helped establish that Harlan had chances to correct course and chose not to. That's a brutal fact in front of county lawyers trying to reduce damages. Mistakes are easier to defend than stubbornness. The county knew where this was going before trial. They knew what a jury would see. A calm federal officer in plainclothes identifying himself early, a deputy rejecting that identification, escalating without verification, searching anyway, and then trying to right the scene in a way that didn't match what cameras captured. On top of that, you had prior complaints and weak intervention from the department. That's how settlements get big. So the county settled. It was the kind of settlement that forces a press conference and makes taxpayers pay for one deputy's ego. Cross received substantial compensation, enough that nobody could pretend the county viewed this as a minor mistake. The exact number got attention for a reason. It was massive. Not because money fixes what happened, but because money is the only language some departments speak clearly once misconduct is too public to bury. Harlan was done after that. His career didn't survive the case. Between the investigation findings, the videos, the civil exposure, and the pressure on the department, there was no path back to normal patrol work. The same deputy who had acted like federal credentials meant nothing ended up as the clearest example of what happens when local authority outruns judgment. Cross handled it differently. He didn't turn into a headline chaser. He didn't go on some revenge tour. He did what disciplined people do when they know they were right from the start. He let the record stand. He let the facts do the work. And in the end, that worked better than roadside anger ever could have. The bigger issue, though, wasn't just Harlan. It was the system around him. A deputy with the wrong instincts got enough confidence, enough room, and not enough correction to believe he could override process, override credentials, and override common sense. He did it in front of cameras. That's why people heard about it. The harder question is, how many times officers like that do smaller versions of the same thing when nobody records? That's why this story matters. Not because a U.S. Marshal won, not because the county paid, because the stop showed exactly how fast routine authority turns abusive when the person using it thinks the badge ends every argument. It doesn't. It never did. And this time, the person on the receiving end knew that, proved it, and made the department pay for learning it the hard way. What would you have done in Cross's position? Have you ever seen an officer keep escalating after being given a clear way to stop? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who thinks knowing the law doesn't matter. And subscribe if you want more stories like this.
Step away from the vehicle.
I already identified myself.
FBI,
You can verify it right now.
I need to search your vehicle.
No consent. Stop. That is federal equipment.
You don't get to tell me what I can search.
You were shown federal credentials before you touched that door.
This sheriff thought he was above the law until he handcuffed the wrong person on a lonely highway. He didn't just violate a man's rights. He interfered with a federal operation and started the chain of events that later put him in prison. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of power and real consequences, like the video and subscribe. It started on a county highway after dark. Sheriff Daniel Cross was heading back through his jurisdiction when he spotted a black SUV and decided to stop it. There was no urgent traffic issue, no reckless driving, nothing that justified the kind of stop he was about to make. The driver was FBI Special Agent Marcus Ortega. He was in the middle of an undercover assignment and traveling alone. The moment he saw the lights, he pulled over safely, shut off the engine, and kept both hands where they could be seen. Cross walked up to the window and asked for identification. Ortega moved carefully, told him he was reaching for his wallet, and presented federal credentials along with his license. That should have settled the stop. Instead, Cross looked at the credentials and told Ortega to get out of the vehicle. Ortega asked why he had been stopped. Cross didn't answer the question. He gave the order again. Ortega stepped out and identified himself a second time. He explained that his status could be confirmed immediately. Cross ignored that and started treating him like a suspect. He asked what Ortega was doing in the county. He asked what was in the SUV. He kept pushing past the one fact that mattered most. The man in front of him had already identified himself as a federal agent. 2 deputies arrived as backup. One asked whether dispatch had verified the credentials. Cross shut that down and kept control of the scene. Then he ordered a search of the vehicle. Ortega stated clearly that he did not consent. The search happened anyway. That decision made things much worse. The SUV contained federal equipment, operational materials, and a service weapon secured in a locked compartment. Ortega told them exactly that. He told them they needed to stop and verify before touching anything else. Cross kept going. When the weapon was found, he acted as if he had discovered evidence of a threat. Ortega immediately explained that it was his issued firearm and that he was authorized to carry it. None of that changed Cross's behavior. He told Ortega he was being detained. Ortega asked for the legal basis. Cross didn't give one that survived later review. He went straight to handcuffs. Ortega did not resist. He turned around, placed his hands behind his back, and let the sheriff cuff him on the shoulder of the highway. The deputies stood there and watched. One of them looked uneasy. Neither stopped it. That was the moment this became a serious federal case. Cross had been shown valid credentials. He had chances to verify them. He had backup on scene. He still chose to arrest first and think later. Then he put Ortega in the back of the patrol unit and kept searching the SUV. What Cross didn't understand was that Ortega was expected to check in as part of an active operation. Once that check-in was missed, people inside the FBI were going to notice fast. They were going to ask why. And the answer was going to lead straight back to a county sheriff who ignored federal ID, searched a federal vehicle, and detained an undercover agent without legal grounds. Cross still acted like he could control the story. He started talking about suspicious behavior, officer safety, non-compliance. The usual words officers use when they need weak facts to sound official. The footage told a different story. His body camera was running. One deputy's camera was running. A passing driver also recorded part of the stop. All of it showed the same thing. Ortega stayed calm, identified himself, gave clear instructions before moving, and never created a threat. Cross had the information he needed. He just refused to accept it. That was the stop. A sheriff with too much confidence made a bad decision, doubled down in public, and handcuffed the wrong man. That's where the case began. Cross took Ortega to the county jail instead of ending the stop on the roadside. That made the situation much worse. Ortega had already identified himself more than once before they got there. Inside booking, he did it again. He stated that he was FBI, that his credentials had already been shown, and that his agency could confirm everything quickly. Cross ignored that and told the booking deputy to process him anyway. The deputy hesitated when he saw the credentials. Cross pushed him forward. That detail mattered later because it showed this was not a fast mistake. Cross had several chances to stop and verify what Ortega was telling him. He refused every one of them. Ortega asked to contact his agency. Cross refused. Ortega then asked for a supervisor outside Cross's command. That was refused too. He also warned them that he was part of an active operation and that holding him without contact would cause a serious problem. Cross treated that like a challenge instead of a warning. The booking process moved ahead. Ortega's property was taken. His service weapon was logged. Temporary paperwork was started. A deputy asked whether dispatch had confirmed Ortega's credentials. Cross answered in a vague way and kept control of the room. That answer stood out later because a simple verification would have ended the matter, and everyone there knew it. At the same time, Ortega missed a required check-in connected to the operation he was working. His federal supervisor tried to reach him, then checked his last known movement and local agency contact points. That quickly led to the sheriff's department. Once federal personnel confirmed that Ortega was in county custody, the situation changed immediately. This was no longer a disputed roadside encounter. It was a documented case of a sheriff holding a federal agent after being shown valid credentials. Federal supervisors came to the jail and demanded access to Ortega. Cross did not back down when they arrived. He started talking about county authority and acted like he still controlled the situation. That position fell apart fast because too many people had already seen the credentials and too many chances to verify had already been ignored. The federal team made it clear that Ortega had identified himself before detention, had not been allowed to contact his agency, and had been booked without proper verification. Cross tried to defend the arrest with the usual language about suspicious behavior and officer safety, but by then those explanations sounded weak even inside his own building. The deputies and jail staff were no longer looking at Ortega like the issue. They were looking at Cross. Ortega was finally brought out and released. He did not argue with Cross. He focused on facts. He noted the time of the stop, the transport, the booking, the search of the vehicle, the seizure of his weapon, and the refusal to let him contact the FBI. That timeline became extremely important later. Cross still did not admit fault. He kept trying to justify the stop even while federal personnel were preserving records. They secured the booking log, property records, names of the officers involved, and camera preservation requests before leaving. They understood exactly what this was becoming. Ortega walked out that night. Cross stayed behind with a jail full of staff who had just watched him ignore federal credentials and push a booking that should never have happened. That was the point where this stopped being a bad arrest and turned into an investigation. Once Ortega was released, Cross still had a chance to limit the damage. He could have stopped talking, preserved everything, and gotten legal counsel. He did the opposite. Before the night was over, he started shaping the story for his own protection. He told people Ortega had been evasive. He claimed the stop raised safety concerns. He acted like the credentials were questionable at first. That story had one problem. The footage did not support it. Internal affairs got involved quickly, but this did not stay a normal county review for long. Federal investigators were already looking at the stop because Ortega had been detained during an active operation. That meant Cross was not just facing department discipline. He was now exposed on the federal side too. The first thing investigators did was secure the video. Cross's Bodycam should have answered most of the early questions. So should the cameras from the deputies who arrived on scene. The booking area also had coverage, That much was obvious. What was not obvious was why some of that footage was suddenly missing. That issue made the case much worse. One segment from Cross's body cam was incomplete. A key section around the vehicle search and the decision to cuff Ortega was not in the normal upload sequence. Investigators checked the file history, access logs, and upload timing. That showed manual interference after the arrest. Now they had a second problem on top of the illegal detention. Somebody had tampered with evidence. Cross tried to distance himself from that almost immediately. He said it was probably a sync issue. He suggested a technical failure. That excuse did not last. The system logs showed the file had been accessed from a department terminal tied to his credentials. Then the reports came in. Cross wrote that Ortega had been uncooperative and slow to identify himself. He wrote that the search became necessary during the stop. He wrote that the detention was based on suspicious behavior and officer safety concerns. Investigators compared that report to the surviving footage, dispatch audio, and statements from deputies. The differences were obvious. Ortega had identified himself early. He had not resisted. He had clearly refused consent to search. He had repeatedly asked for verification instead of escalation. That is when internal affairs stopped treating this like a bad judgment call and started treating it like intentional misconduct. Deputy Alvarez became important at that stage. He had been one of the deputies on scene, and he was not comfortable from the start. At first, he kept quiet. That is common in departments like Cross's. People know who has power. They know who signs schedules, promotions, transfers, and disciplinary write-ups. Speaking against a sheriff is not a small move. But once the footage issues surfaced, Alvarez understood where this was headed. He gave a formal statement. He said Ortega had identified himself clearly at the roadside. He said he had asked whether dispatch had verified the credentials. He said Cross brushed that aside and kept pushing the stop. He also said Cross was more focused on asserting authority than resolving the situation. That statement broke the wall inside the department. After Alvarez spoke, others started talking too. A booking deputy confirmed that Ortega had identified himself again at the jail and had asked to contact his agency. A jail supervisor confirmed he warned Cross to verify the credentials before going any further. Another staff member said Cross looked angry, not uncertain. That detail mattered because it cut against any claim that he was acting carefully in a confusing situation. Then investigators went wider. They pulled prior complaints against Cross and started looking for patterns. They found more than one. Stops that escalated too fast. Searches with weak legal grounds. Reports that used the same vague language over and over. Complaints from citizens who said Cross treated routine encounters like personal challenges. Most had gone nowhere at the time because he ran the department and nobody wanted to fight with the sheriff. Now those old complaints looked different. Not because they suddenly proved every allegation, they didn't, but they showed a pattern of conduct that matched what happened with Ortega. That helped prosecutors later. They were no longer looking at one isolated event. They were looking at a sheriff who had been operating like this for years and finally targeted someone whose agency had the power to hit back. Federal investigators also examined the impact on Ortega's operation. That part was serious. Ortega's detention had interrupted surveillance timing, delayed communication, and exposed part of the operational chain. Prosecutors did not need to prove Cross understood all of that in detail. They only needed to show that his actions obstructed federal work after he had been given clear notice of who Ortega was. And they had that. They had the credentials. They had the timeline. They had the statements. They had the reports. They had the file tampering issue. They had witnesses inside Cross's own department. By that point, Cross's lawyers had a bad set of facts. Their best option would have been to argue poor judgment instead of criminal intent. The problem was that Cross had kept making things worse after the stop. He ignored verification. He blocked contact. He pushed booking. Then he signed off on a false version of events, while footage went missing from a file tied to his own login. That is how bad conduct turns into charges. The county tried to create distance once it became clear how serious the case was. Public statements got more careful. Cross was placed on leave. Then he was stripped of operational authority. The department announced cooperation with both internal affairs and federal investigators. That looked like damage control because that is exactly what it was. Nobody inside that building could save him now. Ortega gave a formal statement and kept it direct. He explained the stop, the identification, the unlawful search, the detention, the denial of contact, and the booking. He did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The facts were already enough. The real collapse came when investigators put all the material side by side. Cross's report said one thing. The remaining footage showed another. The deputy's statements matched Ortega more than Cross. The system logs pointed to evidence interference. At that point, prison stopped being theoretical. This was no longer about a sheriff with a bad temper. It was about civil rights violations, obstruction, false reporting, and tampering with evidence after detaining a federal agent who had told him exactly who he was. Internal Affairs finished its work with findings that were devastating. Cross had violated department policy at multiple stages. He had ignored required verification steps. He had authorized an unlawful search. He had approved a detention without valid legal grounds. He had blocked reasonable access to federal contact, and he had participated in a false narrative after the fact. That report did not end the case. It handed the next stage to prosecutors. When the case finally got to trial, Cross had a real problem. By then, this was no longer his word against Ortega's. Too many people had seen too much, and too much of it had been preserved. The prosecution did not need to turn it into some huge theatrical production. They just had to walk the jury through what happened and show how many chances Cross had to stop before it became criminal. They started with Ortega. He told the jury exactly what happened, from the moment the lights came on. He explained that he pulled over safely, identified himself early, showed federal credentials, and gave Cross repeated chances to verify who he was. He explained that Cross ignored all of that, searched the vehicle anyway, took his weapon, put him in handcuffs, and then blocked him from contacting the FBI after they got to the jail. Ortega did not overtalk it. He did not try to sound emotional. He did not need to. The facts were already bad enough. Then, the prosecution backed him up with the footage and the records. The video showed Ortega staying under control the whole time. No threat, no resistance, no behavior that justified the kind of escalation Cross used. The booking records showed that Ortega was processed, even though his identity could have been confirmed quickly. Dispatch records, property logs, and staff testimony all filled in the rest. By that point, the jury was not looking at a confusing stop. They were looking at a sheriff who had been given the right information early and chose not to accept it. Then came the part that really hurt Cross: the missing footage. A key part of the body camera record was not there in the way it should have been. Investigators had already traced that back through the system logs. The prosecution made the point very clearly: bad decisions are one thing, but once someone starts interfering with evidence after the fact, that tells you they knew they had a problem. Cross's lawyers tried to soften that, but it did not land. The jury understood exactly what that looked like. After that, the deputies and jail staff started filling in the rest of the damage. Deputy Alvarez told the jury that Ortega had identified himself at the roadside and that Cross brushed aside questions about verification. Booking staff said Ortega repeated who he was, again at the jail, and asked to contact his agency. A jail supervisor confirmed that Cross was warned to slow down and verify before pushing the arrest any further. He didn't do it. He kept forcing the situation forward, because by then this was not about law anymore. It was about pride. He had gone too far on the highway, and once they got to the jail, he was trying to protect himself instead of fixing it. That was the core of the whole case. Cross did not make one bad call and then correct it. He made a bad call, then another one, then another one. He ignored federal credentials. He ordered an unlawful search. He handcuffed a federal agent. He blocked contact with the FBI. He pushed the booking anyway. Then he signed off on a version of events that did not match what the evidence showed. That is why the case got so heavy. Not because one thing went wrong, but because everything Cross did after the first mistake made it worse. The defense tried to sell it as a tense roadside misunderstanding. They said Cross was being cautious. They said he needed to secure the scene first and sort things out later. That argument fell apart because later came and went over and over again. At the stop, he could have verified. During transport, he could have verified. At booking, he could have verified. After staff raised concerns, he still could have fixed it. He did none of that. That is what the jury saw. So when the verdict came back, it was not shocking. Guilty on the main counts. Civil rights violations under color of law. Obstruction tied to the federal operation. False reporting. Evidence tampering. Once that happened, the badge was done, the job was done, and the rest was just formalities. At sentencing, the judge treated it exactly the way it needed to be treated. This was not sloppy police work. This was abuse of office. Cross had used the power of his position to detain someone without lawful grounds, then kept abusing that power after multiple warnings. The court gave him a prison sentence. He also lost his certification and his pension. That part hit hard in the county, because a lot of people who had defended him up to that point were still telling themselves he would somehow walk away with retirement intact. He didn't. The sheriff's department took a hit too. Federal oversight followed. Policy changes followed. New rules on outside agency identification, evidence handling, supervisor review, and detention procedures came in right after. Internal affairs got more room to act without local interference. Deputies inside the department started documenting more carefully, because now they had seen what could happen when one powerful sheriff dragged everyone else into his mess. And that is really what this case became. Not just the fall of one sheriff, a warning. Because Cross thought local power would carry him through it. He thought if he stayed aggressive, controlled the paperwork, and acted certain, people around him would fall in line. That worked for him until he picked the wrong target. This time the man in cuffs knew the law, had federal backing, and had a chain of command that moved fast the second he went missing. That is why this story ended the way it did. Not because Cross got unlucky, because he was arrogant enough to ignore the facts in front of him. And once the system closed in, there was nowhere left to hide. What do you think finished him more? The footage, the witnesses inside his own department, or the fact that he kept pushing after he already knew Ortega was federal? Comment your answer. Share this story with somebody who follows cases like this, and subscribe for more.
What are you doing out here?
Walking.
Walking where?
Home.
ID.
What's the reason?
I'm asking for identification.
I heard you. What's the legal reason?
We got a call about a suspicious person.
Walking with a cane?
Turn around.
Whoa, hey, what are you...
This officer thought he found an easy target to bully, but he just made the biggest mistake of his career. Watch as this arrogant patrolman ignores a blind veteran's rights and escalates a peaceful walk into a serious legal violation. He didn't realize who he was detaining until it was far too late. Right now, this officer is standing over a blind man he just put in handcuffs on a public sidewalk. He's still talking like he's in control, still giving commands, still trying to justify what he just did. The man isn't arguing anymore. He's standing still, hands cuffed behind his back, head slightly turned towards the officer's voice, completely composed. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow real situations like this where people stand their ground and officers get held accountable, hit like and subscribe. This situation didn't start aggressive. It started with a simple walk. The man in cuffs is Daniel Carter, 42 years old, a blind Army veteran. He lost his vision during service and rebuilt his life around strict routines. He walks the same routes, uses a white cane, and moves with purpose. Anyone paying attention would immediately recognize he's visually impaired. That afternoon, he was doing exactly that. Walking down a quiet residential sidewalk, using his cane properly, not bothering anyone, not interacting with anyone. At the same time, Officer Ryan Cole was on patrol nearby. Dispatch had just put out a vague call about a suspicious person in the area. No real description, no confirmed crime, just someone walking around. Cole saw Daniel and made a decision right there. He assumed this was the person from the call. Instead of slowing things down, he moved fast. He pulled over, got out, and approached directly. He didn't start with a normal question. He went straight into control mode. Asked Daniel what he was doing there, in a tone that already assumed something was wrong. Daniel stopped and responded calmly. He said he was just walking. That should have been the end of it, but Cole kept pushing. He asked more questions, trying to get something that would justify the stop. Daniel stayed consistent. Short answers, calm voice, no attitude. Then Cole asked for identification. This is where the dynamic changed. Daniel told him he didn't have to provide ID without a valid reason. That's a legally correct response in many situations, especially when there's no clear crime. Cole didn't take it as a legal boundary. He took it as defiance. His tone got sharper. He stepped closer. Now, it wasn't about the original call anymore. It was about getting compliance. Daniel didn't change. He stayed calm, kept his answers simple, didn't raise his voice. That's the part officers like Cole often misread. Calm refusal doesn't match what they expect, so they treat it like resistance. Cole then told him he was being detained. Daniel asked why. Simple question. Direct. Cole didn't give a real answer. He repeated the command and moved in. Then he grabbed him. Daniel reacted to the sudden contact, not aggressively, just instinctively trying to understand what was happening physically. He's blind, so unexpected contact matters more. Cole immediately escalated. He called it resistance. Within seconds, he forced Daniel's hands behind his back and put him in handcuffs. All of this happened fast, but not so fast that it wasn't clearly visible on camera. Cole's body cam was recording everything. His words, his tone, his decisions. And across the street, someone had already pulled out a phone and started filming from a different angle. So now there are two records of the same moment. One from the officer's perspective, one from the outside. Daniel stopped talking after the cuffs went on. He didn't argue, didn't try to explain again. He just stood there and waited. That's not someone confused. That's someone who understands exactly what just happened and knows this isn't over. And the officer still thinks he handled it correctly. That's about to change. Once the handcuffs were on Daniel Carter, Officer Cole should have slowed down and checked whether he had just made a bad stop. He didn't. He kept pushing. He kept talking like the cuffs themselves proved he was right. On the body cam, you can hear him trying to build the case after the detention had already happened. He says Daniel was acting suspicious. He says Daniel refused to cooperate. He says he had to take control of the situation. That's what bad officers do when they know the facts are weak. They start filling the space with authority and hope nobody looks too closely. Daniel didn't help him do that. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't start pleading. He answered when he was asked a direct question. And when it became obvious the officer wasn't listening, he stopped wasting words. That matters because the video doesn't show a chaotic detention. It shows one officer getting more irritated because the person in front of him stays calm and keeps making him sound unreasonable. Cole asked for identification again, but by then that wasn't really the point. He had already put cuffs on a blind man walking with a white cane, and now he needed a reason that looked good on paper. Daniel told him his ID was at home and asked again why he was being detained. Cole still didn't answer that directly. He shifted back to the same vague questions about what Daniel was doing in the area and why he was walking there. Daniel gave him the same answer he had already given from the start. He was out walking. That was it. No change in story. No contradiction. Nothing suspicious, except the officer's need to force this into a bigger incident. Then Cole made it worse by calling for backup instead of checking himself. That's another thing officers do when ego gets involved. Once they feel challenged, they stop looking for facts and start looking for reinforcement. Now the scene is bigger. The scene, more patrol cars, more uniforms, more pressure to stand by the first bad decision. While waiting for backup, Cole kept Daniel in cuffs and kept talking to him in that same clipped, irritated tone. He didn't try to verify the original dispatch call. He didn't ask dispatch for a better description. He didn't ask nearby residents whether they knew Daniel. He didn't do actual police work. He stood there acting like detention was the investigation. That whole time, a bystander across the street was recording. That phone video matters because it shows what the body cam doesn't fully capture from the officer's chest angle. It shows Daniel standing still. It shows the cane on the sidewalk. It shows there was no lunge, no threatening movement, no physical danger that would justify the way Cole handled him. So now Cole has a problem. His body cam records his words, and the bystander video records the scene. When those two things don't support each other, the officer usually loses. Backup arrived within a few minutes. Two officers walked up and immediately started trying to figure out what they had. Cole gave them his version fast. He said Daniel had refused to identify himself and was being uncooperative. He implied Daniel might be connected to the suspicious person call. He used the usual language officers fall back on when they want other officers to accept the detention without questioning it too much. But the scene didn't support him. One of the responding officers looked straight at Daniel, then looked down at the cane, then looked back at Cole. That kind of pause tells you a lot. Even without saying anything, you can tell when another officer realizes the story he's being handed doesn't fully match what's in front of him. They asked Daniel what happened. Daniel answered clearly. He told them he was blind. He told them he was out walking. And he told them he didn't understand why he had been handcuffed. Same tone, same story. No drama. That consistency started hurting Cole immediately because once more people hear both sides, the weak version starts collapsing on its own. One of the backup officers asked Cole if he had confirmed Daniel's identity yet, or matched him to any actual report details. Cole said he was still investigating. That sounds official, but it really meant he had nothing solid. He had already acted first and was trying to figure out the facts second. Then small details started piling up against him. Daniel's answers never changed. The cane was right there. Nobody on scene could point to an actual crime. Cole couldn't clearly explain what specific behavior had justified handcuffing him, and the other officers were now hearing all of this in real time, not from a report later, but with the cameras rolling. Daniel asked again what law he had broken. That's a simple question, and it's deadly for an officer who doesn't have a real answer. Cole didn't name one. He just repeated that Daniel was being detained while they sorted it out. That's the kind of line that sounds fine until you actually think about it. Police don't get to cuff people first and invent the legal basis afterward. At least not if the footage is ever going to be reviewed honestly. One of the backup officers picked up Daniel's cane and handed it back to him more carefully than Cole had handled him the entire time. That moment is small, but it matters. It shows that even on scene, not everybody was reading Daniel as a threat. Some of them were already reading Cole as the problem. Cole tried one more time to make the stop sound justified. He said Daniel matched the description from the dispatch call. But when one of the other officers actually contacted dispatch to ask for the details, the answer that came back didn't help him at all. The call description was too vague to support what he had done, and what little detail dispatch did have didn't clearly fit Daniel anyway. That was the first moment when the ground really started to move under Cole's feet. Up to that point, he'd been talking like the officer in charge. After that, he started sounding like a man trying to explain why he had gone too far. And it was about to get much worse because the next step was identity. Once the other officers started checking Daniel's information, the whole stop began to fall apart. Up to that point, Officer Cole had been acting like he was still in control. He kept repeating that Daniel had been suspicious, that he had refused to cooperate, that the detention was necessary while they figured things out. But once another officer took Daniel's name and ran it properly, this stopped being about Cole's opinion. Now it was about what the record actually showed. Daniel gave his information calmly. Same as before. No attitude, no panic, no change in his story. He told them who he was, where he lived, and answered exactly what was asked. That consistency started hurting Cole even more, because everybody else on scene could hear it. Daniel's version never moved. Cole's version kept needing help. A minute later, dispatch came back with the first confirmation. The name matched. The address matched. Then more information followed, and that's where the mood on scene changed for real. Daniel Carter was a blind Army veteran with a documented service-related disability. His record showed military service, medical discharge related to vision loss, and verified identification that matched exactly what he had been saying while Cole had him in cuffs on a sidewalk. That's the point where this turned from a bad stop into a career problem. One of the other officers looked straight at Cole after hearing the return. Not a long stare, not some dramatic moment, just the kind of look officers give each other when one of them clearly screwed up and everybody knows it. Cole stopped talking over people after that. His tone changed immediately. He started sounding less like an officer giving commands, and more like a man trying to explain himself before anyone asked the next question. He walked back toward Daniel and started speaking more carefully. He tried to smooth it out, tried to make it sound like they were just checking on him, just making sure everything was okay, just following up on a call. But that didn't match what had actually happened. He had already grabbed him, cuffed him, and kept him detained while ignoring repeated questions about why. Daniel didn't help him clean it up. He didn't argue. He didn't give Cole a new opening. He just listened and answered only when necessary. That made the contrast even worse. One man kept adjusting his explanation. The other had been saying the same thing from the beginning. Then one of the backup officers asked the question Cole had been avoiding from the start. What exactly was the legal reason for the detention? That question matters because once another officer says it out loud, the whole thing changes. It's no longer just a citizen asking why he's being stopped. Now it's another cop asking whether the stop can actually be defended. Cole gave the same weak answer about suspicious behavior and refusal to identify. It landed badly this time. Daniel had been walking with a white cane in public. He had answered questions. He had asked why he was being detained. And now his identity had come back exactly as stated. There wasn't much left to hide behind. Another officer said they needed to take the cuffs off. That wasn't a suggestion. It was the point where the scene shifted away from Cole. He hesitated for a second, and that hesitation told the whole story. He knew the stop had collapsed. He knew the cameras were running. He knew the other officers had heard the dispatch return. He also knew this wasn't going to stay on that sidewalk. Then he uncuffed Daniel. Daniel brought his hands forward and rubbed his wrists. He still didn't lose his composure. No speech, no yelling, no emotional scene. He just stood there, got his balance again, and listened. Cole gave him a weak explanation. Not an apology. More like a soft attempt to make the detention sound temporary and reasonable. The usual language. They were checking things out. They had received a call. They were trying to verify who he was. That kind of explanation might work if the stop had stayed verbal. It doesn't work after you've handcuffed a blind veteran in public without a clear legal basis. Daniel then did the smartest thing he could have done. He asked for names and badge numbers. That's when Cole really understood this wasn't over. People only ask for that information when the next step is coming. Complaint, lawyer, internal review, public records request, something official. Cole gave his name and badge number. The confidence was gone from his voice by then. The other officers gave theirs too. Across the street, the bystander was still recording. Nobody had to explain what that meant. Now there was body cam from the officer, phone footage from a witness, radio traffic, dispatch verification, and multiple officers present for the moment the stop broke apart. That is the exact kind of situation departments hate, because once all of that lines up, it gets very hard to bury. And Daniel knew it. He didn't need to argue on the sidewalk. He didn't need to try to embarrass Cole in the moment. The damage was already done, and now there was a record of it. The stop was over. The real problem for Officer Cole was just starting. Daniel didn't go home and forget about it. The same day, he documented everything while it was still fresh. He noted the time, the location, the officers involved, and exactly what happened from the first contact to the moment the cuffs came off. He already had one advantage most people don't. He knew how these cases work and what matters later. By that evening, the bystander video was already circulating. It didn't stay local. Someone posted it, then someone else reshared it, and within hours, it started picking up traction. People weren't reacting to a complicated situation. They were reacting to something simple: a blind man with a cane being handcuffed in public while staying completely calm. The next step was official. Daniel filed a formal complaint with the department. Not a vague complaint, not just a statement. A detailed report. Timeline, officer names, what was said, what wasn't said, and what actions were taken without justification. He requested body cam footage immediately. Once that complaint hit internal affairs, the department had a problem they couldn't ignore, because now they had three things at once: a formal complaint, video from a civilian, and body cam footage from their own officer. That combination forces action. There's no room to delay when everything is already documented. Internal Affairs pulled the footage the same week. When they reviewed it, the issue was obvious. Cole never established a clear reason for the stop. He didn't verify the dispatch call before initiating contact. He escalated to physical detention without confirming any threat or crime. He ignored clear signs of disability, and after the cuffs were on, he kept trying to justify it instead of correcting it. Those are multiple violations at once. Procedure, use of force, detention standards, conduct. And it was all recorded from start to finish. The department placed Cole on administrative leave almost immediately. That's standard when the footage looks bad early. It removes him from the street while they complete the investigation. At the same time, the public side of this started growing. Local media picked it up first, then regional outlets. The angle was clear: blind veteran detained while walking. Bodycam contradicts officers' claims. That kind of headline spreads fast because people understand it instantly. Disability rights groups got involved next. They focused on one specific issue: failure to recognize and properly handle a visually impaired individual. That brought a second layer of pressure on the department, because now it wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about training, policy, and whether officers were prepared to interact with disabled civilians at all. The department released a statement within days. They acknowledged the incident, said it was under investigation, confirmed they were reviewing body cam footage and taking the complaint seriously. Standard language, but the timing told you everything. They moved fast because they had to. Inside the department, the investigation didn't take long. Cases like this are straightforward when the evidence lines up. There's no conflicting story. The video shows the timeline. The audio shows the reasoning. The dispatch records show what information was actually available. Cole tried to defend his actions during the review. He said he believed Daniel matched the suspicious person call. He said Daniel's refusal to provide ID raised concern. He said he acted for officer safety. None of that held up against the footage. The call description was too vague. Daniel's behavior didn't support suspicion of a crime, and nothing in the video showed a safety threat that justified handcuffing him. That's the difference between what an officer claims and what the record proves. Internal Affairs completed the review quickly and forwarded the findings up the chain. The result wasn't a warning, it wasn't retraining. Cole was terminated. The department cited multiple policy violations, including unlawful detention, improper use of restraints, and failure to follow procedures when interacting with a disabled individual. That decision didn't happen quietly either. By the time it was finalized, the story was already public. The department had to show action, and firing him was the only option that matched the evidence. But even after the termination, it didn't end there. Because once a